Say that again? A set of principles in the pursuit of peace. Well, that sounds like bad poetry, but will it actually achieve anything? It might destroy the UN. Okay, that's pretty serious. Yeah. January 7th, 1951. The new year has arrived. If you're a citizen of Seoul, South Korea, then don't use Matt Ridgway's new and improved U.S. 8th Army as an excuse to go too hard on the soju, or else you might just wake up from the New Year's party speaking Chinese. That's right, this week, Seoul falls once again. Indy Neidell, Korean War Desk. Last week, Matt Ridgway arrived in Korea and assumed command of 8th Army just in time to receive a small but deep thrust from the North Koreans to 8th Army's right and the openings of a bigger attack by the Chinese on the left. And as this week gets going, the Chinese begin their push towards Seoul, the South Korean capital, in earnest. Serious attacks begin in the wee hours after midnight on New Year's Day and hit the South Korean ROK 1st and 6th Divisions hardest, north of Tokchon. By the morning, it becomes apparent that the Chinese have crossed the Imjin River, which in a thoughtful gesture has chosen to freeze over for them to do so. Ridgway is briefed on the attacks and also informed of attacks against the ROK 3rd Corps in the center of the peninsula, though info on that is sketchy. But this still makes him pretty sure he will not be able to hold on to Seoul. Maybe the Chinese can't take it outright, but if ROK 3rd Corps buckles and withdraws, he'll have to abandon the city to avoid encirclement. He leaves Seoul, headed north, to check in on the battle for himself. On the road, he finds vehicles full of fleeing ROK troops, so he orders collection posts set up further down the road to gather the fleeing troops and reorganize them before sending them back north. Thankfully for the UN forces, it turns out that for once, these fleeing troops are the exception rather than the rule. Pak Sonyup's crack ROK 1st Division and the less reliable ROK 6th Division still hold, and efforts are being made to plug the gap and fight back. U.S. 9th Corps Commander John Coulter and 1st Corps Commander Frank Milburn have both already deployed their reserves, and they're planning counterattacks. So yeah, already this is a very different 8th Army to the one we've seen in recent weeks. However, more information begins trickling in about the scale of the Chinese attacks against ROK 3rd Corps, and it's clear that the attack is the real deal. Knowing also that the Chinese have much unspent strength in the west, Ridgway orders the counterattack plans canceled and orders 1st and 9th Corps to pull back to a line north of Seoul while the ROK forces retreat some 45 kilometers south to Line C. This is the next planned UN defense line running from Yangpyeong to Wonpo-ri. By the end of January 2nd, the UN forces are in position around Seoul. Early morning the 3rd, the fighting resumes. In fact, around 3 a.m., the Chinese PVA 50th Army engages 1st Corps. At 5 a.m., 9th Corps is hit by the PVA 40th and 38th Armies, and at 7:30 a.m., the British 29th Infantry Brigade is engaged by the PVA 39th Army. All three UN sectors managed to hold their ground and counterattack effectively in the daylight, regaining any territory lost in the early hours. By noon on the 3rd, the attacks on the bridgehead convinced Ridgway that a withdrawal below Seoul had to start soon. While the assaults themselves were not overwhelming, they laid the proverbial final straw on a heavy burden of other problems and disadvantages. The administrative and logistical complexity of moving close to 75,000 troops and their equipment across the Han was a prime concern. So was the problem of clearing the Seoul area of ROK national, provincial, and local government officials, foreigners who included an American embassy group, and possibly the city's entire populace. The availability of bridges proves to be the biggest obstacle to a timely evacuation. The bridges across the Han River south of Seoul were blown back at the start of the war, and nobody occupying the city after that point had seen fit to repair them. Both sides have been content to rely on temporary bridges. Despite this, though, the evacuation and withdrawal go ahead relatively smoothly, certainly in contrast to the withdrawal from Pyongyang last month. This is generally down to the excellent work done by the Americans well ahead of time. As a result of First Corps activity over the previous 2 weeks, the sticky problem of civilian evacuation was not as great as it might have been. Under the guidance and urging of Milburn's civil assistance officers, most non-essential government employees and the families of government officials already had left the city. Refugee camps holding Koreans who previously had come into the city from the north had been cleared. All inmates of Seoul's prisons and jails, the staff and patients of all but one hospital, and the small residents of most orphanages also had been sent south. Likewise, all ROK currency and money plates and the holdings of archives, museums, and galleries had been shipped out. UN forces also managed refugee traffic much better during this withdrawal. Units are placed along the main roads, refusing refugees to pass, and instead shepherding them onto less important side roads. They do this at gunpoint if necessary. Not only does this keep the axis of retreat clear and prevent civilian panic from slowing military units down, it also denies Chinese and North Korean infiltrators the chance to strike behind the UN lines by blending in with refugees, as they have effectively done before. The Chinese do try to keep up the pressure, and there is sporadic heavy fighting over the next 24 hours or so, but 8th Army is conducting a fighting retreat. This is not a rout, and most attacks from the PVA are repaid in kind. A notable exception is the British 29th Infantry Brigade, one of the last UN units still north of the Han River. They face the heaviest fighting of any UN unit during the withdrawal, and have acquitted themselves well. But just before midnight the 3rd, the brigade's rear guard is blocked off and hit hard by elements of the PVA 39th Army once the rest of the brigade has left the area. Ridgway wants to get them out and orders an attempt be made, but at this late stage of the withdrawal, there really isn't much that can be done. Even Brigade Commander Thomas Brodie shrugs at the idea and says his men will have to knock it out for themselves. Some of them do, but around 300 Brits and a handful of tanks are lost. The last civilians to escape Seoul do so early morning the 4th. By 8 a.m., the Han bridges have been blown, and leaflets are dropped into the city announcing that anyone now trying to cross the river will be considered hostile and fired upon. In all, over 500,000 civilians get out during these days, much of the population having already left earlier. Ridgway is fine with the communists having Seoul because there's almost nothing left there for them. So less than an hour after the last UN troops evacuate the city, Chinese troops occupy it. Another retreat, sure, but the performance has given Ridgway some cause for optimism. 8th Army, at least the western part of it, has pulled off a fighting retreat, maintaining cohesion while under attack, and according to their own timetable. The Chinese have employed artillery in attacks against Line B. The UN response has been solid. Counter-battery action and air power is effective at silencing the Chinese guns. This, plus the supply situation that plagues the Chinese, means that their offensive is already losing steam. However, things in the center and the east have not gone as well as they have in the west. A large force of North Korean troops there has pushed their way to the Hongcheon area just north of Wonju and are now in a position to exploit their breakthrough in several directions. See, Hongcheon is pretty central, and from here the KPA, the North Koreans, can strike south at Wonju, infiltrate through the mountains to the southeast, or push southwest behind U.S. 1st and 9th Corps and try to trap them. These possibilities make a UN retreat to Line D unavoidable. This line originally ran from Pyeongtaek northeast to Wonju and then up to Wonpo-ri on the east coast, but Ridgway now alters the line in the east to end at Samcheok rather than Wonpo-ri. On this revised line, the KPA would be unable to get behind 1st and 9th Corps easily, and it would give Ned Almond's 10th Corps a little more time to finish reorganizing and mount a proper defense. The 1st and 9th Corps retreat in good order, mostly emptying places like Incheon and Kimpo airfield of supplies and equipment before abandoning them. By today, the 7th, they're in their defensive positions on Line D. However, the ROK in the east move more slowly and are still in disarray as the KPA push further south and today begin to bisect the UN lines. Ned Almond is at least on hand to start putting some new defensive positions in place. He assumes command of the ROK 2nd, 5th, and 8th Divisions as they trickle into his sector, and along with U.S. 2nd Division at Wonju, he sets up a defensive line. However, there is still a significant gap between the boundaries of 10th Corps and ROK 3rd Corps. And General Cho Hyun, commander of the North Korean 2nd Corps, has his eyes set on that gap. His divisions get underway as this week ends, and I imagine we'll see how the reformed KPA really performs next week, and if the UN forces here can mount the same resistance as in the West. Back over in Washington, resistance is now proving to be just as stubborn as in the west of Korea. Okay, despite being the leading partner in the war, the US has not been able to act entirely unilaterally while still claiming to be conducting a police action in Korea. And now, US congressional worries about a UN-brokered peace deal with China begin to emerge. Many in Congress believe, somewhat correctly I should add, that America's European allies would be receptive to the idea of throwing nationalist Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek under the bus if it means more favorable terms with Mao Zedong's communist China. To the Republican Party, whose popularity has recently surged, this is unacceptable. On Korea itself, the Republicans occupied an ambiguous position. While sympathizing with MacArthur's demands to escalate the war, spokesmen also called for evacuation. Korea was not the place to engage the massive land armies available to the communists. These apparently contradictory approaches came together on the issue of Taiwan. Whatever happened in Korea, the Kuomintang regime was the key to the U.S. position in the Far East. On the issue of Asia in general, there is still an unresolved, or perhaps an irreconcilable conflict with the British. See, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson wants the West to show a united front in the face of the Chinese intervention and openly condemn what he calls Chinese aggression. For the British, it is not that simple, and the prospect of Asia going hot is a lot less appealing than it might be for the United States. First of all, Britain still has territories like Hong Kong and Singapore, which would be vulnerable to Mao's forces in the event of an expanded war. Second, there is India. India gained independence from Britain in 1947 and now sits on the UN Ceasefire Committee, responsible for trying to bring the various parties together. Britain does not want to alienate India with future cooperation between the Commonwealth states still being worked out. This places Britain and the Commonwealth states in a difficult position, caught between the interests of Washington and London. As the Australian diplomat Watt remarked, the Commonwealth representatives found themselves on the horns of two dilemmas. No set of terms acceptable to Washington was likely to find favor in Beijing. Moreover, while everyone wanted to keep in line with the Americans, nobody agreed with the steps which Washington contemplated. At this impasse, the Ceasefire Committee at the UN reports on the 3rd that there are no useful suggestions it can make at this time. Britain, however, proceeds to pull off something of a diplomatic masterstroke. They request that the Ceasefire Committee draw up a list of principles for ceasefire talks in time for the next session of the UN. This might not sound too significant, but it may actually resolve the issue. See, if the US accepts the recommendations and China rejects them, then it becomes much easier to label China as an aggressor. If both Washington and Beijing accept or both reject the recommendations, then it leaves the Commonwealth states distinct as a third party without having to commit to one line or another. It could potentially backfire if Washington rejects them while Beijing accepts them, but that does appear to be the most unlikely option. We shall see what the Ceasefire Committee comes back with and how it is received. We'll see that in the future, for this week of the war is over. On the surface, the Chinese have scored another great victory and occupied the South Korean capital. But the reality on the ground is very different. Ridgway's new, sturdier 8th Army has managed to retain their initiative, and if Ned Allman could plug the leak in the east, may very well be able to hold and counterattack. Ridgway has already achieved a lot in his first 2 weeks, more than anyone on the ground currently realizes, simply by avoiding defeat and steadying the ship. I'm going to end today with this somewhat chilling analysis from Max Hastings' The Korean War. How close did the United States come in the winter of 1950 to employing atomic bombs against the Chinese? Much closer, the answer must be, than its allies cared to believe at the time. if Truman and the fellow members of his administration recoiled from bearing the responsibility for so terrible an act, America's leading military men, from the Joint Chiefs downward, were far more equivocal and seemed far less disturbed by the prospect. All those at the seat of power in Washington drew back from discussion of the nuclear option as the military situation in Korea improved. But have the Chinese proved able to convert the defeat of the UN forces into their destruction? Had the Eighth Army been unable to check its retreat and been driven headlong for the coastal ports with massive casualties, it is impossible to declare with certainty that Truman could have resisted the demands for an atomic demonstration against China. The pressure upon the politicians from the military leaders of America might well have become irresistible in the face of military disaster. The man who turned the tide on the battlefield in Korea in the first weeks of 1951 may also have saved the world from the nightmare of a new Hiroshima in Asia. Okay, Matt Ridgway may have just saved the world. Now he faces the much harder task of saving Korea. So, welcome to 1951. We shall continue our coverage of this conflict, even if it lasts all year long. And we can do that thanks to the Time Ghost Army. You too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com and be part of this adventure. Michael Opachny is the Army Member of the Week, and these are the newest commissioned officers. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.